Hello, and welcome back to Modern World History with Dustin Fowler. Today, we're going to talk about the Northern Renaissance. So, we spent some time earlier looking at the Renaissance, and we learned that it began in Italy, and we call that the Italian or the Southern European Renaissance. And we also know from talking about that there is a process of diffusion which is going to take place. And what we meant by diffusion was that it's going to be the spread of something. In this case, we're going to call it the spread of ideas. So this spread of ideas is going to happen in a few different forms. So Renaissance ideals really began to diffuse and spread after the plague. So we already kind of talked about this earlier when we looked at the Italian Renaissance. Before that, you've got the 100 Years' War, which, I guess 100 Years' War goes well into the 1400s. And during this period, or after this period of the plague and the 100 Years' War, you begin to see where cities began for the first time in a long time to really grow. And there was increasing movement between the different cities that were growing up during this time. So you start to see growing populations led to increased trade, interaction, and wealth within these cities. In turn, the more wealth that you have and the more interaction and the more trade, the more people are going to come in contact with extravagant art, and it's going to lead them to become patrons of the arts. Okay, we talked about these are people who sponsor artists. All right. And that's kind of a big deal because artists can't afford to paint for a living if nobody pays them a ton of money to do it. I mean, I've got some artist friends, and it's hard to do unless someone supports you in some way, because you're not going to be able to feed yourself by producing art. Someone's going to have to support you. So that's what these sponsors or these patrons are. And so the more that these cities begin to emerge as wealthy with growing populations, you start to see more art patrons. And then the art patrons and the people that interact in these new cities began to travel to other parts of Europe outside of just Italy. And so you start to see where people in France, people in Flanders, or people in other parts of Europe, all the way up to England, start wanting to get their hands on some form of Renaissance art. And so wealthy patrons in Europe began to import Italian art. So they would first begin with, when we talk about this word import, they had it brought in. All right. So they would actually pay people in Italy to produce art for them in the Renaissance fashion, and they would have it brought in. So northern artists caught on to this and began to travel to Italy in order to learn how to create art in the Renaissance style. And then once they moved back up north or wherever else in Europe they kind of took what they learned and were able to apply it in a local sense to create, in a lot of ways, brand new art that was characteristic more so to their culture than the Italian culture. But still, you're looking at the same basic concept of humanism in your art. Okay, so they didn't go away from this. At any point, you never see them go away from the idea of humanism being the driving force of what their art was. Some of the most famous Northern Renaissance painters, definitely this guy Albrecht Dürer. All right, arrow did not come out right. Albrecht Dürer was he's like in a lot of ways the Leonardo da Vinci. Excuse me, as I made that giant blunder there. Not that DiCaprio is not a great artist in his own right, but Albrecht Dürer becomes kind of like the Da Vinci of the North. So just a very, very well-known, very popular, very fantastically influential Northern Renaissance artist. And his most important work was probably this version of his self-portrait, which really is made in a very Christ-like pose. Not to get too deep into that, but usually when you see like a forward-facing portrait in this manner, he kind of was depicting himself as the Christ in a lot of ways. There's a significance about the date here. This one here, I think, was in the year 1801, which he signed somewhere on here. You can see also, and forgive me for not being able to blow this up, I'm going to use a different color. But you can see here where that is his signature. He had his own like insignia in a way, like his monogram is the word I'm looking for. And so he didn't just outright sign his name, but he actually used his unique monogram as a symbol of his artwork. And he also, I mean, just it's a fantastic piece of art. I would recommend that you go in and really take the time to Google this particular piece. And look at it more closely. Just the level of detail, the intricacies of the fur he's wearing and the hair, the way his fingers are kind of gripping the hair there. Just a very magnificent work of art. Albert Dürer is all about his extreme realism, as you can see. But another thing that he did that was very, very new to art was that he made mass engravings. All right, so he would actually take his art and he would like use a woodcut engraving template to create like thousands of different versions of his unique art. And so there was one thing that was very unique, new, and very cool about Albert Dürer, who was a German. Hans Holbein the Younger was the portrait master, I guess the person more than anyone else who's going to go and take photographic portraits of King Henry VIII. All right. So, very, very well known for his portraits of the king, and he was the king's personal painter. He even sent, I guess, Henry VIII even sent Hans Holbein to take a picture of one of his wives, who we'll talk about in a later video. And I'm guessing that he was a pretty accomplished artist, but when he saw the lady in real life, he likened her to the look of a horse, rather than to say she was as beautiful as the picture had depicted her. So maybe he is, I don't know, maybe he also had your world's first photographic filter, if you will. Peter Bruegel, that's how you say this, is Peter Bruegel was from Flanders, which is kind of around northern Europe and around Germany. It's in Belgium today. And you're looking at just everyday scenes, like such as this picture here, which is in the Patterns of Interaction World History textbook, which is where a lot of my notes and images are kind of based on. I know that the image is very, very hard to see here, but Peter Bruegel paints these images of just everyday people doing everyday things, such as this peasant wedding. And if you were to look a little closer here at this particular image, you would see that there's people carrying food. This kid here is licking a pot. You've got dogs roaming around, people just doing their everyday things. They're not all posing in front of the table like you would have seen in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper image, where they're all just kind of looking on one side of the table in these just awestruck poses because they just learned that one of them is going to kill Jesus. No, these guys here are doing very natural stuff, looking very natural while doing it. And so that's one of the big characteristics of Peter Bruegel's work. There's everyday people doing everyday things. All right. Northern writers also had like their own unique flair in a way. And one of these things is you see a lot of these Christian humanists coming from the north. And the two most important here are going to be Thomas More and Desiderius Erasmus. These are Christian humanists. In other words, they're going to take the humanism that makes up what the Renaissance is, but they're not going to be as secular about it. They're going to link that back into how to be better Christians, how to live for God a little bit better, or how to be more devout in their Catholic Christianity. And so one thing that these humanists believed, or one thing that they were critical, very critical of the way the church was being run at the time. And they also were focused on societal reform. So they wanted to make changes to the way that people were living. In particular, they saw a lot of corruption in the church that they thought needed to be addressed. They also believed that education should be for everyone, including girls. And this here was a very unique mentality, a very liberal mentality for priests to have held at the time. So in the year 1509, all right, Praise of Folly was written by Desiderius Erasmus. All right. And in this book, he kind of makes fun of Christians. He talks about a Christianity of the heart. He made fun of secular issues, to be more exact. He would look at greedy merchants, the squabbling, the fighting, the quarrels that occurred between people doing business with one another in an effort to get rich. He would look at pompous priests, in other words, church corruption. People that were more arrogant in the priesthood and not focused so much on the things that they should be focused on in order to be ideal Christians. They would look at quarrelsome scholars, people who question the way things are and fight about their questions they might have between one another, and also heartsick lovers. And we can all look and see plenty of that in our own popular culture. Another thing, too, about Erasmus, and that he kind of writes about a little bit in his Praise of Folly, is that all should study the Bible. So he was one of these first Christians to believe that anyone should seek out information by studying the Bible. Now, it also needs to be said that at the time of Erasmus and more, only priests were expected, or only people who were clergymen within the Catholic Church were expected to read, understand, and interpret the Bible. It was not something that was viewed as interpretable by just any old ordinary person. And so we're going to see how that mentality starts to shift when we start talking about the Protestant Reformation in the next section. In 1516, Utopia was written by Thomas More, and the word utopia means no place, and it describes an ideal society. In other words, a perfect society. Now, we know that such a place does not exist. And that's kind of like, in many ways, the point here is he was kind of looking at, hey, if we lived maybe the way we should and didn't value money so much and didn't go after each other in such ways, maybe we would live in a world that, is perfect. And so that was one of his big things there. And both these guys are going to be your Christian humanists. You've also got a female writer, a French female writer named Christine de Pizan, who wrote in the French vernacular, and she was a little bit of an advocate for women's education. So again, this idea that women should be able to engage in politics, engage in the same activities, and do the same things as men was very, very limited. Not very many people held to that, but she was very much about women's education, and she believed, or she wrote short stories, poems, and biographies, and all sorts of different things of that nature. William Shakespeare. We've all heard of him. Most of us are going to read Julius Caesar in the 9th grade. I'm sorry, just said Julius Caesar. Romeo and Juliet. Many of us are going to read Julius Caesar in the 10th grade or somewhere along the way. Some of us may read Hamlet and Macbeth, and some of you may have just read these things anyway on your own fruition. That's great. But William Shakespeare was one of the most notable playwrights of all time. He did more than just write plays. He was also a poet. He also created and added to the creation of many vernacular English words. And so he's known somewhat of a wordsmith, if you will, within the English language as well. He was a humanist. He both lauded human capacity. That means he upheld it. He celebrated it. And he also wrote about their flaws at the same time. So he would kind of look at, here's the things that we're capable of as people, but we also screw up a lot. And that's kind of in a lot of ways who we are when you really break it down and look. Now, the last thing that I want to mention, we looked a lot at the artists, we looked a lot at the writers of the Northern Renaissance movement, but one of the things that I really want to talk about before we get into the next session is the ultimate game changer, the printing press. Okay, it was like, I mean, we thought that email was great in the early 90s. We think that social media is awesome. We are able to see breaking news the second that happens, and it's distributed worldwide as it's going on. But back then, the printing press was the one that served all these purposes. So you, for the first time, were able to write a book and then quickly copy that book and then redistribute it throughout different cities within Europe. And so this led to the widespread diffusion of ideas like never before. And this was a huge game changer in terms of delivering content and getting ideas from one place to another. And it's going to make a big difference in the next 100 years that we're going to be studying in this time frame. It was the social media of its day. Books, news, ideas were made readily available for cheap. It was created by a guy named John Gutenberg, and he was a German. One of the first, I'm going to say possibly the first book that would have been published in mass in the way we're describing here would have been the Gutenberg Bible. I want to say that Martin Luther himself was the one who took the time while he was in hiding. We're going to talk about next session. He took the time to translate the book from Latin into the German vernacular for it to be published. So this is going to be a big part of all of that. And so hopefully you are ready to learn and ready to roll. Thanks for watching.